I walked into court alone, while my family strolled in like they had already won. They expected me to panic over a lawsuit for $2.3 million. They had no idea their law firm just lost its biggest corporate client because the person they were suing was me. If your relatives underestimated you until they smelled money, listen to the end. Tell me where you are listening from. My name is Emery Hernandez. I am 38 years old, and I have spent nearly 10 years building a life my family always swore was impossible. I say this without bitterness, without the dramatic sigh of a misunderstood victim. It is simply a statement of fact. Much like a ledger entry, you calculate the starting balance, you track the deficits, and eventually, you realize that some accounts are better left closed forever. To understand how I ended up sitting in a courtroom staring down my own blood, you have to understand the Hernandez family of Port Sterling, Florida. If you know Port Sterling, you know the type of environment I'm talking about. It is a coastal town where the veneer of wealth is far more important than the actual balance in your checking account. My family ran Sunridge Restoration Group, a hurricane recovery and home repair chain that had been around just long enough to brand itself as a local institution. We lived on a carefully curated diet of country club memberships, high-profile charity galas, and the kind of loud, performative wealth that screams of deep-seated insecurity. My father, Victor Hernandez, was the patriarch in the most exhausting sense of the word. For Victor, the objective truth was entirely subjective. What truly mattered was power. Specifically, his power over the narrative inside our house and his influence within the local chamber of commerce. My mother, Celeste Hernandez, was his perfect counterpart. Celeste was utterly obsessed with social standing. She measured human worth by zip codes, country club tiers, and exclusive event invitations. Then there was my older brother, Grant Hernandez. Grant was the golden boy, the charismatic, broad-shouldered heir apparent, who was handed the keys to the kingdom simply because he looked the part of a rugged, commanding contractor. In this highly staged production, I was cast early on in the role of the disappointment. I did not have Grant's loud, room-filling charm, nor did I have my mother's talent for superficial networking. Worse, I had no interest in the family business of swinging hammers, negotiating with subcontractors, and shaking hands with local politicians. I gravitated toward numbers, data analysis, and insurance risk management. To Victor and Grant, this was not real work. Real business meant physical assets, heavy trucks adorned with massive logos, and slapping mayors on the back. My work was invisible, digital, and therefore entirely irrelevant to them. They neatly boxed me into the role of the paperwork girl. I cannot possibly count the number of Sunday family dinners where the ambient noise consisted of ice clinking in expensive crystal glasses and casual. Cutting remarks aimed directly at my career choices, Grant would carve the roast, flash a charming smile, and tell their assembled friends, "Emery does computers. If you ever forget your password or need your email fixed, she is the one to call." My father would chuckle in agreement, shaking his head affectionately as if my entire existence was a cute, harmless hobby meant to keep me busy until I found a husband. They never once bothered to learn what risk management actually entailed. If they had, they might have recognized the quiet danger I posed. Eventually, the atmosphere became too suffocating to endure. I packed my life up, left Port Sterling, and escaped the crushing gravity of Sunridge Restoration Group. I took a mid-level position at a data insurance firm called Northline Risk Systems. It was there that I made a highly conscious, deliberate decision to vanish from their radar. I lived purposely well below my means. I drove an unremarkable, used sedan, rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and never once mentioned my income or my corporate promotions to anyone back home. Whenever I was forced to visit for Thanksgiving or Christmas, I wore simple clothes. I sat quietly at the table and let them dominate the conversation with grandiose tales of their expanding fleet of trucks and Grant's supposedly visionary leadership, while they were busy expanding their massive debt to finance a lifestyle they could barely afford. I was paying strict attention to the machinery behind their industry, working long shifts at Northline Risk Systems, I spotted a massive bleeding gap in the market. Every single hurricane season, large insurance companies and disaster repair units were hemorrhaging millions of dollars due to a profound lack of oversight. They desperately needed an airtight, automated system to verify construction claims, detect fraud in real time, and track the highly complex chain of payments flowing between insurers, contractors, and vulnerable homeowners. Nobody was doing it right. The existing software was archaic, slow, and full of loopholes. So, I decided to do it myself. I started writing the foundational architecture for what would eventually become Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence. It began as a small, quiet project occupying my nights and weekends. I poured every single ounce of my savings, every hour of my free time, and every bit of analytical skill I possessed into building and refining the core algorithm. Over the course of 5 grueling years, Blue Harbor steadily grew from a scrappy team of 3 people working out of a cramped co-working space into a formidable, highly profitable enterprise. We secured initial contracts with regional insurers, which quickly snowballed into massive deals with national carriers. By the time I hit my late 30s, Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence was processing billions of dollars in claims data across the United States. I went from being a nameless data analyst to the chief executive officer of a tech company that literally held the operational lifelines of the very industry my family falsely thought they had conquered. Yet, through it all, I kept my mouth entirely shut. I never bought the flashy sports car to show off. I never showed up at a Port Sterling charity gala wearing designer labels. I maintained my absolute, impenetrable financial invisibility. People outside my family, those who knew my actual net worth and the scope of my operations, often asked me why I did it. They assumed I suffered from severe imposter syndrome or that I was somehow ashamed of my massive success. That could not be further from the truth. I was deeply, fiercely proud of Blue Harbor and the empire I had built from absolutely nothing. I hid my success because I understood the toxic psychology of the Hernandez family better than anyone else on earth. They did not value me as a human being. They only valued tangible assets. I knew, with absolute mathematical certainty, that the very second they realized I had built something of immense monetary value, they would not offer warm congratulations or express parental pride. They would simply look at my life's work, calculate its exact worth, and immediately try to figure out how to take it from me. So, I let them keep their comfortable illusion. I let Grant firmly believe he was the undisputed titan of the restoration industry. I let Celeste believe her superficial charity luncheons were the absolute pinnacle of human success. I let Victor believe he was the only true mastermind in our bloodline. I sat quietly in the shadows, reinforcing my fortress, knowing that one day, the undeniable rot inside their foundation would inevitably cause their whole house to collapse. And when that day finally came, I wanted to make absolutely sure they could not use my foundation to break their fall. The collapse of a supposedly wealthy family does not happen overnight. It is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, agonizing bleed, masked by heavy cologne and freshly leased luxury vehicles. For Sunridge Restoration Group, the bleeding started right after 2 consecutive, brutal hurricane seasons. Nature had been incredibly generous to my brother. The storms tore roofs off half the county, and the insurance checks flowed like a river. Grant took that temporary surge in revenue and convinced himself he was a singular business genius. Instead of building a cash reserve, he expanded with terrifying speed. He signed predatory, high-interest commercial loans to purchase a massive fleet of heavy-duty trucks, all custom-wrapped with the company logo. He signed ironclad, 10-year leases on enormous, climate-controlled warehouses to store industrial dehumidifiers and generators that would soon sit gathering dust. When the weather inevitably calmed down the following year, the lucrative disaster contracts vanished, the monstrous monthly overhead. However, did not. My father refused to acknowledge the water rising around their ankles. Victor's entire identity was tied to his seat at the head of the local business community. So, he kept playing his weekly 18 holes at the country club, smiling broadly, buying rounds of expensive scotch for regional bank managers, and casually lying about their quarterly projections. He projected an aura of absolute financial invincibility to keep their creditors temporarily sedated. Meanwhile, my mother waged her own desperate war to maintain our family's pristine social facade. Celeste became a master juggler of revolving debt. She aggressively cycled through high-limit credit cards, paying off one minimum balance with another, all while continuing to host lavish philanthropic luncheons. She would plunge the family thousands of dollars deeper into the red, just to ensure the local society photographers captured her wearing a new designer gown. To her, a localized economic depression was acceptable as long as her face remained on the front page of the Port Sterling lifestyle magazine. Inside the company walls, the atmosphere was toxic. As the profit margins evaporated, Grant refused to look in the mirror. He spent his days pacing the office, aggressively shifting the blame to everyone but himself. He screamed at his project managers, claiming the local market was suddenly saturated. He blamed the state legislature for new building codes. Most frequently, he blamed the insurance carriers, loudly complaining that they were unfairly tightening their payout regulations. The reality was much darker. Grant's management was catastrophically sloppy, and to hide the hemorrhaging cash, he had begun heavily manipulating their internal accounting. He was routinely overbilling for materials never used and inflating labor hours on the few meager jobs they still had, desperately trying to keep the sinking ship afloat. It was around this time of suffocating financial panic that my name began echoing in their house again. The restoration industry is surprisingly small, and rumors travel fast. A cousin mentioned at a summer barbecue that I had purchased a rather beautiful home in a highly exclusive neighborhood. A local broker casually asked my father if I was still consulting for the major national insurance carriers. Noting that he heard I was making incredibly good money, they brushed these comments off outwardly, but the seeds of desperate curiosity were planted. The turning point came during a statewide charity gala for disaster relief. I attended because several of my key corporate clients were sponsoring the event. I was standing near the ice sculpture, quietly discussing a multi-million-dollar software integration with 3 chief executive officers from top-tier underwriting firms. I did not see my mother at first. Celeste was hovering near the silent auction tables, nursing a cocktail she likely could not afford. She saw me. She saw the executives leaning in, listening intently to every word I said, treating me with undeniable, profound respect. Instead of walking over to say hello, she stayed hidden. I learned later from a mutual acquaintance that she spent the rest of the evening violently rationalizing the scene. She convinced herself I was merely acting as a glorified secretary, a mid-level liaison taking notes for the real executives. Acknowledging my authority would have meant admitting her own irrelevance, but the fragile dam of their denial finally broke a month later. Grant was attending a regional risk management seminar, desperately searching for loopholes to get his increasingly fraudulent claims pushed through the system. During the keynote presentation, an industry auditor displayed a slide showcasing the future of automated fraud detection. Dead center on the massive projection screen was the logo for Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence. Grant froze. It was a highly distinct, geometric Blue Harbor crest. He stared at it, his mind racing back to a tense Thanksgiving dinner several years prior. He suddenly remembered walking past the kitchen island and seeing that exact same blue logo stuck to the lid of my silver laptop. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The system that was systematically flagging his inflated invoices, the software that was currently choking the life out of his fraudulent revenue streams, belonged to his little sister, the paperwork girl. He rushed back to Port Sterling and called an emergency family meeting behind the closed, heavy oak doors of my father's study. They were staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy. Their trucks were weeks away from repossession. The banks were calling in the commercial notes. They desperately needed an immediate, massive infusion of cash. A normal family, a healthy family, might have swallowed their pride, picked up the telephone, and asked for a lifeline. They might have apologized for a lifetime of dismissive cruelty and begged for a personal loan to save the family legacy. But the Hernandez family was fundamentally incapable of humility. My father's fragile ego could never stomach the idea of kneeling before his daughter. Grant would rather burn the company to the ground than admit I was smarter than him, and my mother needed a narrative where they were the aggrieved. Noble victims, not the desperate beggars. They did not want to ask for help. They wanted to take it by force. They needed a weapon to extract the money. And in their twisted minds, the legal system was the perfect tool. Over the course of 3 frantic, whiskey-fueled nights, they meticulously engineered a complete fabrication. They dug through old financial records, looking for anything they could twist. They decided to invent a story that my entire empire was built on their backs. They drafted a fictitious narrative claiming that years ago, they had provided me with a massive, undocumented seed capital loan to start my business. They pulled a number out of thin air, a number large enough to clear all of their crippling corporate debt and leave plenty left over for my mother's country club dues, $2.3 million. Their strategy was built entirely on a fundamental underestimation of my character. They firmly believed I was still the quiet, non-confrontational girl who used to stare at her plate during dinner to avoid an argument. They assumed that the sheer terror of public litigation, the threat of having my corporate reputation dragged through the mud, and the heavy emotional weight of family shame would instantly break me. They were absolutely convinced that the moment I was served with a lawsuit for $2.3 million, I would panic, call my lawyers, and quietly offer a massive, confidential settlement just to make them go away. They thought they were setting a brilliant, inescapable trap. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into mine. The certified mail arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the second week of October. At the time, the executive floor of Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence in Halcyon, Georgia, was operating at a fever pitch. We were in the final, agonizing stages of a massive Series C funding round. It was the kind of transaction where a single leaked rumor could cost us tens of millions of dollars. The air in the office was thin with stress. When my executive assistant handed me the thick manila envelope marked for personal delivery, I assumed it was another stack of tedious compliance disclosures. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. I slid the heavy stack of legal-sized paper onto my mahogany desk. The header at the top of the first page read, "In the Superior Court of North Bristow County." My eyes skipped down to the plaintiff line. Victor Hernandez, Celeste Hernandez, Grant Hernandez. The air vanished from the room. I sat perfectly still. The complaint was a masterclass in aggressive, fabricated litigation. According to the document, I had allegedly received a capital rescue note from my family in the fall of 2019. The principal amount demanded was $2.3 million. The narrative claimed this money was the sole foundational funding for my company, and I had maliciously, intentionally defaulted on the repayment. Worse, the filing included an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction. They were petitioning the judge to freeze my personal and corporate bank accounts, specifically targeting the incoming capital from my impending Series C round. The justification was laughable but dangerous. They claimed I was exhibiting clear signs of asset dissipation. I flipped to the signature page to see who was foolish enough to file this garbage. The name was Preston Vale. He was a senior litigation partner at Westbrook Hale Cartwright, LLP. In the legal community, WHC was a notoriously vicious firm. They were known for burying defendants in procedural paperwork until they simply ran out of money and surrendered. I did not surrender. I analyzed. I spread the exhibits across my desk like crime scene photos. It took my trained eyes exactly 4 minutes to dismantle their lies. First, there was a copy of a supposed bank transfer confirmation. The bank logo printed at the top was the modernized, minimalist version the institution only rolled out in 2021. It was completely anachronistic for a document allegedly printed in 2019. Second, the routing and account number formats did not match the digit structure that specific bank used during that era. Finally, there was the promissory note itself. At the bottom of the page sat my supposed signature. It was a sloppy forgery, but more importantly, it featured a distinctive, exaggerated loop on the letter E. That was a stylized flourish I had actively stopped using a decade ago. But none of these amateur mistakes were the real bombshell. The true shockwave hit me when I looked at the law firm's letterhead again. Westbrook Hale Cartwright, LLP. I stared at the heavy embossed letters until they blurred. WHC was not just a random group of aggressive litigators. They were Blue Harbor's external corporate counsel. For the past 4 years, WHC had handled our employment contracts, our intellectual property disputes, and most critically, they were actively quarterbacking the exact Series C funding round my family was currently trying to freeze. It was a catastrophic, career-ending breach of legal ethics. A law firm cannot sue its own active corporate client. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for Talia Mercer. My internal general counsel. Talia was a razor-sharp former federal prosecutor who did not tolerate incompetence. She walked into my office 90 seconds later, took one look at the lawsuit, and turned visibly pale. I pointed to the plaintiff counsel block. Talia read the name Preston Vale out loud. The silence that followed was suffocating. "This is a severe, actionable conflict of interest," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "This is an absolute malpractice nightmare. Preston Vale must be operating completely outside their internal review system, or their conflict check software is broken. I am calling their managing partner right now. We are terminating their retainer immediately. And I am filing a grievance with the state bar by 5 o'clock. Talia reached for her phone. I placed my hand flat over hers, stopping her. "Do not call them," I said quietly. Talia stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Emery, they are actively trying to freeze our operational capital based on forged documents. You cannot let them stay on our payroll." "I can, and I will," I replied, carefully gathering the forged exhibits back into a neat pile. "If we fire WHC today, Preston Vale will instantly realize his mistake. He will withdraw the filing, claim it was an administrative oversight, and my family will simply hire a new lawyer tomorrow. They will fix their forged documents. They will learn from their mistakes. I do not want them to learn. I want them to commit." Talia narrowed her eyes, slowly understanding the absolute ruthlessness of my instruction. "You want them to walk onto the ice while it is still thin." "Exactly," I said. "I want Preston Vale to stand up in open court, on the official record, and aggressively argue this case. I want my father, my mother, and my brother to perjure themselves under oath, completely confident that they have a shark representing them. I want the door to shut and lock behind them before they realize they are in the wrong room." Talia let out a slow, measured breath. "What is our play for the first hearing?" "I am going to represent myself," I told her. "I am going to walk into that courtroom looking small, unprepared, and terrified. I want Preston Vale to look at me and see an easy target, while I distract them with a weak defense. You are going to quietly activate our external digital forensics team. I want every piece of metadata pulled from these exhibits. I want a certified letter from the bank's fraud department confirming the logo and account number discrepancies. Bring in a handwriting expert to establish the timeline of my signature evolution." Talia nodded, a sharp, dangerous smile finally appearing on her face. "And WHC? Let the corporate partners at WHC keep billing us for the transaction," I said, feeling a cold, unfamiliar calm settling deep in my chest. "Keep sending them emails. Keep paying their invoices. Build an impenetrable paper trail proving they are actively representing Blue Harbor on the very same day their litigation partner is trying to destroy its chief executive." I picked up the lawsuit one last time and placed it inside my desk drawer. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to step inside. I did not issue a company-wide memorandum regarding the lawsuit. Panic is a highly contagious corporate disease, and I refused to let my family infect the culture I had built. Instead, I pulled my core executive team into a secure, soundproofed conference room on a Thursday morning and laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. We were mere weeks away from closing our massive funding round, and I needed my leadership completely focused on the finish line, not distracted by a fabricated family grievance. I instructed them to maintain absolute silence outside that room. Immediately after that meeting, I initiated a formal, legally binding litigation hold. I sat down with our chief technology officer and instructed him to lock down and archive every single piece of corporate correspondence, calendar invitation, and data file even tangentially related to my family or the early origins of the company. I effectively froze our digital footprint in amber. There would be no accidental deletions, no routine server purges, and absolutely no room for the opposing counsel to claim we had tampered with evidence. I built an impenetrable digital fortress around the truth, securing the perimeter before my family even realized the war had begun. While I managed the corporate optics, my legal team operated entirely in the shadows. Talia and her forensic experts moved with absolute surgical precision. They did not just look at the forged documents, they dissected them. They obtained legally binding, sworn affidavits from the bank verifying the chronological impossibility of the account structures my family had submitted. They pulled years of tax returns and official notary logs. They compiled an exhaustive, visually undeniable timeline of my personal signature from 2010 all the way to the present day. The exhibit clearly demonstrated exactly when the stylized, loopy flourish they had so clumsily forged had been permanently retired from my handwriting. Then came the psychological warfare. My personal phone rang incessantly, vibrating across my desk like a trapped insect. My father and my brother alternated their approaches, trying to find the crack in my armor. First, Victor would call. He would leave voicemails using his deep, resonant, paternal tone, suggesting we just sit down like reasonable adults and figure this out over a cup of black coffee, when I did not engage with his false warmth. Grant would take over. He would leave aggressive, demanding messages insisting that I step up, stop hiding behind my lawyers, and handle my financial responsibilities to the family. I answered precisely none of these calls. Whenever I was legally or logistically obligated to reply, I sent short, sterile text messages acknowledging receipt. I gave them absolutely nothing to use against me. My mother took a vastly different route. Celeste left a sprawling, heavily rehearsed voicemail that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Her voice trembled with perfectly modulated, practiced emotion. She started by saying she was so incredibly sorry it had come to this ugly situation, but then the velvet glove slipped off completely. She casually mentioned that if I forced them to take this matter to a public trial, if I blew this out of proportion, she would have absolutely no choice but to talk to the local media. She promised to paint a devastating, tearful picture of an ungrateful, ruthless daughter who had abandoned the very people who sacrificed everything to give her a start in life. It was a transparent, clumsy extortion attempt wrapped in maternal concern. I calmly saved the audio file to 3 separate, secure servers. The most critical piece of intelligence arrived on a Tuesday evening. My phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted, temporary number. It was my cousin, Marisol Vega. Marisol was a grown woman, a quiet, hyper-observant administrative assistant who had worked in the Sunridge back office for over 6 years. She was the only person in that entire building who actually paid attention to the details. Her message was brief, terrifying, and incredibly validating. Do not sign a single thing. They are reprinting the old papers in the office right now. That one single text message triggered a massive, quiet shift in my strategy. I asked our internal risk assessment team to run a discreet, perfectly legal financial diagnostic on Sunridge Restoration Group. The results they brought back were staggering. My family had just taken out a massive, high-interest secondary mortgage on their primary equipment yard. Furthermore, they were over 90 days delinquent on payments to 3 of their largest local subcontractors. The picture became instantly clear. This lawsuit was not an emotional outburst. It was not a petty family squabble over a misunderstanding. It was a desperate, calculated act of survival. They were a drowning entity trying to pull me under the water just so they could catch a single breath. They did not just want my money. They needed it to avoid total ruin. The supreme, almost comical irony of the entire situation played out daily in my corporate email inbox, even as Preston Vale was meticulously preparing to destroy my life in civil court. Another senior partner at Westbrook Hale Cartwright was enthusiastically emailing Blue Harbor every single afternoon. This partner, completely oblivious to his colleagues' aggressive litigation, was happily sending over revised transaction term sheets and warm congratulatory notes regarding our impending funding round. The sheer, breathtaking incompetence of the firm was staggering. The right hand was actively suing the very chief executive the left hand was billing thousands of dollars an hour to protect. With all the pieces firmly on the board, I finalized my strategy for the preliminary hearing. I knew exactly how my family would arrive at the courthouse. They would treat the county civil court like a prestigious red carpet event. They would wear tailored, expensive suits, flash heavy jewelry, and project an aura of unshakable, aggressive confidence. I decided to give them exactly the opponent they expected to see. I planned to arrive completely alone. I would wear a simple, muted gray suit. I would carry a single, thin leather portfolio instead of a massive, rolling cart of evidence. I wanted to look isolated, underfunded, and deeply intimidated. I wanted Preston Vale to look across the aisle at me and feel an overwhelming, intoxicating surge of overconfidence. Arrogance is always the absolute enemy of preparation. I needed my family and their high-priced lawyer to feel so entirely secure in their impending victory that they would step up to the podium and say far more than they ever should. I was not interested in a loud, dramatic confrontation. I was playing a long, quiet game of psychological chess, and they were still trying to figure out how to set up the board. The heavy wooden doors of the North Bristow County Civil Court swung open at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. I walked into the corridor alone. I carried a single slim leather portfolio under my right arm. The hallway smelled of industrial floor wax and nervous sweat. I found a quiet bench near the back and waited. 10 minutes later, the Hernandez family made their grand entrance. They did not walk. They paraded. They moved as if they were stepping onto a red carpet at a charity gala, rather than attending a preliminary civil hearing. My father wore a bespoke charcoal suit that aggressively highlighted his broad shoulders. My mother had chosen an emerald green silk blouse and a staggering amount of gold jewelry, perfectly styled to look like old money. Grant flanked them, projecting the false confidence of a wealthy real estate developer. They looked completely unified, rich, and untouchable. Trailing slightly ahead of them was Preston Vale. He looked exactly like the kind of high-priced attack dog Westbrook Hale Cartwright was famous for breeding. He had expensive, aggressively polished shoes and a perfectly tailored navy suit. As soon as he spotted me sitting alone, a predatory smirk crossed his face. He adjusted his briefcase and strolled over, leaving my family a few paces behind. "Ms. Hernandez," Preston said, his voice dripping with loud, theatrical condescension, "I see you have not retained outside counsel. Representing yourself pro se is certainly a bold choice for a case involving $2.3 million. I will be entirely frank with you. The judge is not going to have patience for amateur hour. We are perfectly willing to sit down in a conference room right now and discuss a structured settlement before this gets incredibly ugly for you." I looked at him, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. "I appreciate the advice. Mr. Vale, I think we will let the judge handle it." Preston chuckled softly, shaking his head as if pitying a stubborn child. "Suit yourself." Once inside the courtroom, the bailiff called our case. Judge Ellison Ward presided. She was a no-nonsense magistrate with a reputation for moving her docket along with ruthless efficiency. Preston Vale immediately took the podium and launched into a highly aggressive opening monologue. He painted a masterful, entirely fictional portrait of a loving family brutally betrayed by a greedy, manipulative daughter. Then, Preston made his first massive, unforced error. He pivoted to his emergency motion to freeze my assets. "Your Honor, we are requesting an immediate preliminary injunction on all of the defendants' corporate and personal accounts. We have highly credible intelligence indicating that Ms. Hernandez is on the absolute precipice of receiving a massive influx of liquid capital from external investors. If she is allowed to receive this money unencumbered, she represents an extreme flight risk. We must secure these funds immediately to protect my client's original investment. I sat at the defense table and carefully wrote his exact words down on a yellow legal pad. He had just handed me a golden piece of leverage by openly citing an impending influx of liquid capital. Preston had unwittingly confessed on the official court record that they knew exactly about Blue Harbor's upcoming Series C funding round. They had deliberately timed this fraudulent lawsuit to hold my company hostage at its most vulnerable financial moment. Next, my mother took the witness stand. Celeste delivered a performance worthy of a daytime television award. She produced a single, delicate tissue and dabbed at her dry eyes. Her voice trembled perfectly as she recounted how they had supposedly drained their own operational reserves to give me a chance at the American dream. She looked directly at the judge and whispered that all she ever wanted was for her daughter to do the right thing. Grant was called next to corroborate her story. This was where the foundation began to show its cracks. Grant was a terrible liar under pressure. Preston asked him to describe the family meeting where I supposedly signed the promissory note. Grant shifted uncomfortably in the heavy wooden chair. We met in the office, Grant testified, clearing his throat loudly. It was late, maybe a Tuesday evening, or a Thursday. Mom and Dad were there. We laid out the terms, and Emery agreed. When it was my turn to cross-examine him, I did not stand up and scream about perjury. I stayed seated and kept my voice calm, almost bored. Grant, I asked, who physically printed the promissory note we are discussing today? Grant blinked, caught off guard by the mundane procedural question. I did, from my office computer, and after I allegedly signed it. Who took possession of the original document? Dad did. Grant answered quickly. He locked it in the company safe that exact same night. I nodded and wrote that down. Thank you. No further questions. The final witness was Mason Pike, my father's former financial manager. My brother had clearly paid him handsomely to act as an independent witness. Mason took the oath and confidently swore that he had been in the room the night I signed the $2.3 million capital rescue note. Mr. Pike, I said, standing up and walking slowly toward the witness box. You claim you were physically present when I executed this document in the fall of 2019. Could you please describe the room where this signing took place for the court reporter? Mason smiled, thinking he had memorized the script perfectly. Absolutely. We were in the main executive conference room at Sunridge Restoration. We sat at the long mahogany table. I distinctly remember the heavy oak paneling on the walls and the dark green carpet. It was a very formal setting. I stopped walking. I stared at him until his arrogant smile began to falter. Are you absolutely certain about the oak paneling and the green carpet? Mr. Pike? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Yes, I am certain, he replied, his voice pitching up a fraction of an inch. I turned my back to him and walked to my table. Thank you, Mr. Pike. That is all. I did not bother to tell the judge right then that my father had completely gutted that specific conference room 18 months before the date on their fabricated document. The heavy oak paneling and green carpet had been completely torn out and replaced with frosted glass walls and polished concrete floors a year and a half before Mason Pike claimed he sat in that room and watched me sign my life away. I let the perjury sit untouched on the official record, perfectly preserved, like a fly in amber. Preston Vale leaned back in his leather chair at the plaintiff's table. He shot me a smug, victorious look. He honestly believed my short, seemingly disjointed cross-examination was the desperate flailing of a woman who had completely run out of options. He thought I was just wasting the court's time because I had no real defense. I sat down, opened my thin leather portfolio, and slid my phone out from underneath a legal pad. I unlocked the screen. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffling of papers as the judge reviewed the requested injunction. I opened my secure messaging application and selected Talia's name. I typed a single, decisive command. Activate the conflict notice and terminate the contract. Right now. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and waited for the ceiling to collapse. Judge Ellison Ward looked down at me from the high mahogany bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and asked if the defense had any preliminary response to the motion for the asset freeze. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of an auditor delivering a final terminal report. I walked to the clerk and handed over 3 thin, neatly bound folders. I kept a copy for myself and handed one across the aisle to Preston Vale. He took it with a dismissive scoff, not even bothering to open the cover. "Your Honor," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The plaintiffs have asked this court to freeze my assets based on a supposed $2.3 million capital rescue note executed in the fall of 2019. However, the foundational documents submitted by Mr. Vale are not merely inaccurate, they are easily demonstrable forgeries." Preston immediately stood up, his face flushing red. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making wild, slanderous accusations without a shred of legal counsel to guide her." "Overruled," Judge Ward snapped, her eyes already scanning the first page of my binder. "Proceed. Ms. Hernandez, if you look at the first document in my folder, you will find a sworn, notarized affidavit from the chief fraud investigator at the plaintiff's banking institution. I stated, the plaintiffs submitted a wire transfer confirmation indicating they moved $2.3 million into my account. However, the exact routing and account sequence printed on their exhibit did not exist in their bank system in 2019. According to the bank's own sworn records, that specific account bracket was not generated or opened until the spring of 2022. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. My father shifted violently in his seat. Secondly, I continued, turning the page. The plaintiffs submitted family meeting minutes to corroborate the signing of this phantom note. Alongside Mr. Mason Pike, there is a second witness signature on that page belonging to an independent contractor named Arthur Pendleton. The document is dated October 12, 2019. I have submitted Mr. Pendleton's official state death certificate. He passed away from cardiac arrest in April of 2019. It is a biological impossibility for him to have witnessed me signing anything 6 months after his funeral. The color completely drained from my mother's face. She looked at Grant, whose jaw was tightly clenched. Finally, "Your Honor," I said, driving the last nail into the casket, the promissory note itself bears a state notary seal. If you reference my third exhibit, you will see a direct verification report from the state secretary's office. The commission number on that stamp does not match the chronological logbook for that specific notary. The stamp was fabricated. Preston Vale slammed his hands onto his table. He was scrambling, his arrogant veneer entirely shattered by the cold. Hard weight of forensic truth. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant is throwing up technical arguments and fabricated allegations to dodge a legitimate family debt. We demand a continuance. We request at least 14 days to bring in our own forensic experts to review these sudden, ambush documents. You will not need 14 days. Mr. Vale," I said softly, turning to face him directly. At that precise second, the heavy silence of the courtroom was broken by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. It was Preston's mobile phone, sitting face up on the plaintiff's table. It buzzed once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Preston glanced down, annoyed by the interruption. But his eyes locked onto the illuminated screen. I watched the absolute terror wash over his features. He picked up the device with a trembling hand. The screen displayed an urgent, high-priority email from the global managing partner of Westbrook Hale Cartwright. I knew exactly what that email said because Talia Mercer had sent the termination notice to his firm exactly 3 minutes ago. I turned back to Judge Ward. The judge was watching Preston's physical collapse with deep suspicion. "Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, "Mr. Vale does not need a continuance because he is legally barred from standing in this courtroom. The plaintiffs claim I am a flight risk about to receive a mysterious influx of capital. That capital is a Series C corporate funding round. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence. Judge Ward's eyebrows shot up. She instantly recognized the name of the massive tech firm. And until exactly 3 minutes ago, I continued, pointing a steady finger at the trembling lawyer across the aisle. Westbrook Hale Cartwright was Blue Harbor's primary external corporate counsel. Mr. Vale's firm represents my company. They have been actively managing the very financial transaction he is currently trying to freeze on behalf of my family. Mr. Vale failed to conduct a basic ethical conflict check. He is currently attempting to sue his own firm's largest corporate client. The courtroom felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out through the ventilation vents. Judge Ward's demeanor shifted from irritated magistrate to absolute, unbridled fury. She slammed her wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "Mr. Vale," she roared, her voice vibrating with judicial rage. "Is this true? Are you actively litigating against a current client of your own firm?" Preston could barely speak. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. "Your Honor, the conflict check system, the subsidiary name," he stammered, entirely unable to form a coherent sentence. "Shut your mouth before you make this worse for yourself," Judge Ward commanded. She pointed a sharp finger at him. "This court completely denies the plaintiff's emergency motion for a preliminary injunction. The asset freeze is denied. Mr. Vale, you are ordered to submit a full, sworn written explanation of this catastrophic ethical breach to my chambers within 48 hours. I am also submitting an immediate referral to the State Bar Disciplinary Committee." She then turned her furious gaze toward my family. My father looked pale. His broad shoulders suddenly slumped. "To the plaintiffs," the judge said, her tone dripping with contempt. "Your current counsel is hopelessly conflicted and likely facing severe sanctions. You have exactly 10 days to secure new legal representation. If you fail to do so, or if I find that these documents were knowingly forged by you to extort the defendant, I will dismiss this case with prejudice and refer the three of you to the district attorney for criminal perjury charges. We are adjourned." I packed my single, thin leather portfolio and walked out of the courtroom. I did not look at them. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor. Before I could reach the elevators, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. It was Grant. His face was twisted in a mixture of humiliation and desperate rage. He grabbed my shoulder to spin me around. I knocked his hand away effortlessly. "You think you are so incredibly smart." "Emery," Grant hissed, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "You think you can just embarrass us and walk away with all that Series C money? You owe us. You would be nothing without the name we gave you." I stopped dead in my tracks. I stared into my brother's eyes, dissecting the exact phrasing he just used. "Series C money," I repeated softly. I never mentioned the specific tier of the funding round in that courtroom. "Grant, I only called it an influx of capital." Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He realized his catastrophic mistake instantly. "You did not just stumble onto Blue Harbor's name by accident," I said, the cold realization settling over me. "You actively monitored my corporate filings. You knew exactly when my company was closing its Series C round, and you timed this fraudulent lawsuit perfectly to hold my valuation hostage." He took a step back, his bravado crumbling into genuine fear. He had just confessed to premeditated, calculated financial extortion out loud in a courthouse hallway. I gave him a single, chilling smile, turned on my heel, and stepped into the elevator, leaving him standing entirely alone in the wreckage he had built. The shock wave from Judge Ward's courtroom did not just rattle the courthouse, it leveled the entire corporate legal landscape of our district. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Westbrook Hale Cartwright had officially lost Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence as a client. We did not just terminate their monthly retainer, we forcefully excised them from the Series C funding transaction, which was scheduled to close in less than 14 days. They lost millions of dollars in expected billable hours in a single afternoon. But the financial blow was nothing compared to the catastrophic destruction of their reputation. The corporate law and insurance sectors are incredibly insular communities. By Wednesday morning, the rumors were tearing through the city like a wildfire. Every managing partner at every major firm knew exactly what had happened. Westbrook Hale Cartwright had blindly sued the chief executive officer of their own anchor client. The sheer, breathtaking incompetence of failing to run a basic conflict check became a cautionary tale overnight. Inside the firm, a brutal civil war broke out. Preston Vale was immediately suspended and stripped of his access to internal files to save face. The senior equity partners desperately tried to contain the blaze by issuing quiet statements blaming the entire disaster on a rogue partner's individual negligence. They threw Preston to the wolves, which only incited the remaining partners who knew the firm's automated software was equally to blame. My family, meanwhile, was experiencing their own unique brand of panic. The reality of their situation was finally piercing their deep delusion. My father called me on Thursday evening. He did not yell. He used his deepest, most soothing voice, the one he usually reserved for negotiating with angry bankers. "Emery," he said, completely ignoring the fact that he had just committed perjury against me, "let us be reasonable business people. This whole court thing has gotten entirely out of hand. If you can just help us with a little debt restructuring, cover the immediate vendor invoices, we will drop the lawsuit. We can just forget this ugly past and move forward as a family." I listened to the absolute audacity of his proposal. "You do not have the leverage to negotiate." "Victor," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion, "you do not drop a fraudulent lawsuit against me as a favor. You are drowning, and you are asking the person you just tried to stab to throw you a life preserver. I am not giving you a single dime. Do not call this number again." The next day, my mother escalated the situation. Celeste actually drove the 3 hours from Port Sterling and walked into the grand lobby of Blue Harbor Claims Intelligence. I allowed my security team to escort her up to the executive floor because I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to see the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the rows of brilliant analysts, and the quiet, humming machinery of a multi-million-dollar empire she had absolutely no part in building. She stepped into my office, her eyes darting nervously around the imported furniture and the abstract art on the walls. The sheer scale of my reality finally crushed her preconceived notions, yet her fundamental nature remained entirely unchanged. "It is a beautiful office, Emery," she began, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "But you really should be helping your own flesh and blood before you build palaces for strangers. We are your family." I sat back in my chair and looked at her. I felt no anger, only a profound, hollow pity. "You are missing the entire point," I told her. "You did not come looking for me when you thought I was a mid-level data processor living in a small apartment. You did not care about my well-being when you thought I was ordinary. You only remembered you had a daughter when you ran out of money and needed someone to steal from. You are not here because you love me. You are here because you are terrified of going broke." She left my office in tears, but they were tears of frustration, not remorse. Since their private manipulation tactics failed completely, Grant decided to take the battle to the public square over the weekend. A heavily edited audio file began circulating among the local business owners and country club members back in Port Sterling. It was a recorded telephone call from 3 years prior. Grant had masterfully spliced different sentences together to make it sound like I was aggressively laughing at their financial struggles and gleefully refusing to help my sick parents. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to brand me as a cold, inhumane corporate villain. My phone started lighting up with messages from distant relatives and high school acquaintances, all demanding an explanation for my supposed cruelty. The temptation to log onto the internet and destroy Grant with the forensic evidence was strong, but I refused to play his petty, emotional game. I handed the audio file directly to Talia Mercer. We instructed our public relations risk management team to monitor the local chatter while our legal department quietly added the defamation attempt to our growing pile of counterclaims. I would not fight my brother in the comment section of a social media platform. I would bury him in a court of law. The final devastating weapon arrived late Sunday night. My cousin Marisol called me from a prepaid cellular phone. Her voice was shaking. She had been watching the fallout, and the guilt of remaining silent was finally outweighing her fear. "Emery," Marisol whispered, checking over her shoulder even though she was alone in her apartment. "I have something. I could not sleep after the hearing. I stayed late at the Sunridge office on Friday night. I copied the internal network drives onto a secure external flash drive." I sat up straight in the dark. "What exactly do you have on that drive?" "Marisol, I have the original, unedited draft files of the promissory note," she said, her breath catching in her throat. "I have the digital printer logs showing exactly when Celeste printed them. It was 2 weeks before they filed the lawsuit, not years ago. But Emery, if I give this to you, if they find out I betrayed them, Victor will fire me. He owns the building my apartment is in. He will evict me. I will have absolutely nothing." I closed my eyes and let the magnitude of her bravery wash over me. She was holding the smoking gun, the undeniable, irrefutable proof of their criminal conspiracy. I had the power to end the war entirely. "Do not worry about your job or your apartment," I told her softly, my mind already calculating the logistics of her extraction. "Pack your bags tonight. I am sending a private car for you in the morning." My family thought they could control the narrative by spreading lies in the shadows. They had no idea I was about to turn on all the lights. I did not treat Marisol's move like a dramatic rescue scene. There were no tearful reunions and no speeches about loyalty. I handled it the way a high-risk witness situation should be handled. Quietly, quickly, and with legal protection in place. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my legal team had set up a secure attorney-client channel for her. We moved her into discreet corporate housing out of state and retained independent employment counsel to protect her from retaliation. The process was efficient and carefully documented. I made sure she was safe and comfortable, but I kept clear boundaries. Emotional improvisation complicates legal strategy. Once Marisol was secure, Talia handed the flash drive over to our digital forensics department. What they pulled from that drive was not just evidence. It was a masterclass in technological incompetence. My family had assumed that if a document looked old on the surface, it became old in reality. The metadata embedded in the supposedly ancient 2019 promissory note told a painfully clear, irrefutable story. The digital file had been authored on a laptop registered to Celeste Hernandez exactly 3 weeks before they filed the lawsuit. Furthermore, the internal spooling logs from the Sunridge office network showed the exact life cycle of the forgery. The documents were sent to the primary office printer at 2 o'clock in the morning. They had printed crisp, new pages, deliberately crumpled and stained them, and then scanned them back into the system using a low-resolution setting to artificially degrade the image quality. They wanted the digital copies to appear aged and heavily handled. Instead, they just created a perfectly time-stamped map of their own crime. My legal team did not stop at the digital footprint. They started pulling at the financial threads connecting my brother to his star witness. Mason Pike was not just doing a favor for his old boss out of lingering loyalty. Financial discovery through our private investigators revealed that Grant had recently authorized a payment of $15,000 to a murky litigation support limited liability company. A quick dive into state registry records proved that the company was wholly owned by Mason Pike's brother-in-law. Grant had literally bought his perjury using Sunridge corporate funds, leaving a paper trail wide enough to drive one of his heavy-duty restoration trucks through. The most seismic revelation, however, did not come from the flash drive. It came from the radioactive fallout inside Westbrook Hale Cartwright. As the firm's internal damage control team desperately tried to figure out how their automated conflict system had failed so spectacularly, the truth began to leak out through terrified junior associates looking for immunity. Preston Vale had not made a careless administrative error. He had intentionally bypassed the mandatory conflict check protocol. The investigation revealed that during a casual internal firm meeting weeks prior, Preston had overheard the corporate partners discussing Blue Harbor's impending Series C liquidity event. Preston realized immediately that if he ran my name or my company's name through the official intake system, It would instantly flag the conflict and hard block his lucrative family lawsuit. So, he manually overrode the software, rushing to file the injunction before my funding round closed so he could hold my capital hostage. He had weaponized confidential insider information, obtained through his own firm's attorney-client privilege with my company, to extort the chief executive officer of his own firm's largest client. The dispute had instantly mutated from a pathetic family shakedown into a massive, career-ending violation of professional legal ethics and corporate espionage. Emboldened by these discoveries, my risk analysts started digging even deeper into the Sunridge server data Marisol had provided. They quickly noticed a terrifying, repetitive pattern. The exact same metadata signatures, the late-night printing times, and the low-resolution scanning of artificially aged documents appeared in several of my family's recent commercial insurance claims. Whenever an insurance adjuster pushed back on a questionable roof repair or an inflated water damage invoice, miraculously, old, highly convenient work orders and signed homeowner authorizations would suddenly materialize in the Sunridge files. My family had not invented this forgery scheme specifically for me. They had been successfully running it against regional insurance carriers for months to artificially inflate their dying revenue. The temptation to hand this massive insurance fraud dossier directly over to the state authorities and watch my family face federal racketeering indictments was overwhelming. But Talia Mercer walked into my office late Thursday night and placed her hand firmly on the thick stack of forensic reports. "We are not the police, Emery," she said quietly, maintaining her sharp, prosecutorial focus. "If we introduce their systemic insurance fraud into our civil response, we will severely dilute our own narrative. The judge will be forced to pause our proceedings to untangle a massive, multi-year criminal conspiracy involving dozens of third-party insurance carriers. That could delay our summary judgment and our funding round for years." I stared at the data illuminated on my monitor. She was absolutely right. I did not need to burn the entire forest down just to stop the wolves currently scratching at my door. Expanding the scope of the war would only give my family time to breathe and reorganize. I instructed Talia to strictly compartmentalize the insurance data and lock it away in our secure servers. We would focus the absolute entirety of our legal firepower on the immediate, undeniable threat. We spent the weekend drafting a devastating counterfiling. We laid out the metadata, the printer logs, the witness payoffs, and the law firm's ethical breach in agonizing, sequential detail. We demanded severe judicial sanctions against the plaintiffs for submitting fabricated evidence, and we initiated a massive countersuit for abuse of process and civil fraud. I agreed with Talia's strategy completely. A dramatic confrontation in a crowded room would not help me. Neither would the messy, unpredictable satisfaction of emotional revenge. What I needed was an airtight, mathematically clean legal trap. I wanted a file so clean and undeniable that when my family finally fell, they would not be able to blame me, the economy, or the insurance market. They were going to collapse under the crushing, undeniable weight of their own fabricated paperwork. Within the 10 days Judge Ward granted for them to secure new representation, my family hired Price Kellett Legal Group. They were a mid-tier boutique firm, hungry enough to take on a high-stakes contingency case, but perhaps not quite sharp enough to see the massive steel trap waiting for them. Realizing the original forged documents were completely radioactive, the new legal team attempted a desperate, clumsy pivot. They filed an amended complaint, trying to aggressively shrink the narrative. Instead of relying on the fabricated 2019 promissory note, they suddenly argued that the $2.3 million was merely a verbal family agreement. They flooded the docket with heavy legal jargon, claiming unjust enrichment and implied financial contracts. The strategy was comically flawed and entirely contradictory. They were essentially standing in front of the civil court arguing that they absolutely possessed original, binding, written contracts, but simultaneously asserting they did not actually need to show them because it was all just a casual fireside understanding. You cannot claim a paper trail exists and then beg the judge to ignore the paper trail when it proves you committed fraud. While their new lawyers flailed in the courtroom, The physical walls of Sunridge Restoration Group were rapidly closing in. Local heavy equipment suppliers and independent building contractors had completely stopped sending polite reminder emails. They started physically showing up at the loading docks and the front reception desk, loudly demanding immediate payment. Under the crushing weight of impending bankruptcy and severe judicial scrutiny, the fragile Hernandez family unity finally shattered. My father and my mother began viciously turning on one another, through mutual acquaintances. I heard that Victor openly blamed Celeste for leaving a blatant digital trail on her laptop, while Celeste screamed that Victor was the incompetent one who failed to secure the corporate money in the first place. Grant was caught in the middle. Entirely cornered by his own ballooning personal debts, they attempted one final, highly orchestrated emotional ambush. An elderly great-uncle passed away, prompting a solemn family memorial service at a local chapel. I attended strictly out of respect for the deceased. There were no children present, only the older generation of the Port Sterling community, dressed in dark suits and black dresses. Celeste saw an audience and immediately seized the opportunity. After the eulogy concluded, she cornered me near the large floral arrangements in the vestibule, making absolutely sure she spoke loudly enough for the surrounding aunts and uncles to hear. She manufactured fresh, glistening tears, begging me to stop tearing our precious family apart over simple financial misunderstandings. She pleaded with me to just come home, drop the aggressive counterclaims, and heal the terrible divide. She desperately wanted me to react. She needed me to raise my voice, to shout, or to look exactly like the cruel, heartless corporate monster Grant had tried to paint me as on social media. I gave her absolutely nothing. I maintained perfect, icy composure. I looked directly into her eyes, quietly offered my sincere condolences for her obvious emotional distress, turned on my heel, and walked out the heavy front doors. I did not let her provoke me into a public spectacle. That evening, the pressure cooker finally exploded. My brother reached his absolute breaking point and requested a completely secret meeting. We met in the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner out on the county interstate. Far away from anyone who knew us, Grant looked terrible. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled, and his hands visibly shook. He was backed into a terrifying corner by his own creditors, and he offered me a transactional deal. He claimed he possessed a raw, unedited audio recording of our parents actively planning the entire extortion scheme. He promised to hand the file over to my legal team immediately if I agreed to quietly pay off his personal credit card debt and his auto loans, which totaled roughly $95,000. I stared at him through the cold night air, feeling a profound sense of disgust. I told him very clearly that I do not buy testimony, and I absolutely do not negotiate with extortionists. I got back into my vehicle and drove away, leaving him standing alone under the flickering neon sign. I did not have to pay him a single dime. Exactly 3 hours later, the raw audio file arrived in my secure corporate inbox anyway. I learned later that Grant had returned to the Sunridge executive offices that night only to discover a drafted legal memorandum sitting on his father's desk. Victor and Celeste were actively preparing to throw him completely under the bus. They were planning to tell the lawyers at Price Kellett that Grant had acted entirely alone, that he had forged the documents without their knowledge to save his failing restoration company, and that they were merely the innocent victims of his desperate deceit, to save his own skin from criminal perjury charges. Grant decided to burn his parents to the ground. I sat in my home office and played the digital recording. The audio was crystal clear, captured secretly on a mobile phone left on a desk. It was a vicious argument between my mother and my father. I heard Celeste clearly say that they needed to figure out a way of making the signature look older before they scanned it. A few minutes later, Victor's deep voice cut in, saying they absolutely had to sue before she closes the deal with the corporate investors. It was the clearest proof yet of premeditated fraud. When I handed the audio file to Talia Mercer the next morning, Price Kellett immediately caught wind of the leak and filed a frantic, panicked motion to suppress the recording. They argued heavily about two-party consent laws, the technical validity of the file, and the overall admissibility of secretly recorded family conversations. Talia just smiled her sharp, highly dangerous prosecutor smile. We let them waste their billable hours fighting the audio tape because we did not even need it to win. Our entire legal strategy remained firmly anchored to the irrefutable, unemotional facts. We had the digital metadata pulled directly from Celeste's hard drive. We had the sworn corporate affidavits from the banking institutions. We had the fraudulent notary logs verified by the state. We had the internal emails from Westbrook Hale Cartwright proving the catastrophic ethical breach. And we had independent, airtight testimony from Marisol, perfectly preserved and protected. The audio file was just the final, suffocating blanket thrown over their burning house. Recognizing the highly explosive nature of our counterclaims and the severe, documented allegations of evidence tampering, Judge Ellison Ward decided she had seen enough procedural gymnastics. She issued a firm, unyielding judicial order. She officially scheduled a comprehensive, all-day evidentiary and sanctions hearing. There would be no more delays, no more amended complaints, and absolutely no more legal hiding places. Every single piece of evidence, every lie, and every forged signature was going to be laid out under the bright fluorescent lights of her courtroom. It was the precise, inescapable moment I had been meticulously engineering since the very first day the process server handed me that lawsuit. The board was fully set, the pieces were locked, and the final move was finally mine to make. The morning of the final evidentiary and sanctions hearing felt entirely different from my first solo appearance. The gallery inside Judge Ellison Ward's courtroom was packed wall to wall. Word had spread through the local legal community, and dozens of young associates from various firms crowded the wooden benches to watch the implosion of a major corporate law firm and a local business dynasty. I did not walk in alone this time. Talia Mercer and my full litigation team flanked me. Yet, I maintained the exact same minimalist, composed demeanor. I wore a simple navy blazer and sat quietly at the defense table. Across the aisle, my family sat rigidly with the lawyers from Price Kellett Legal Group. The arrogant veneer they wore on day one had completely dissolved into sheer, suffocating panic. Judge Ward wasted absolutely no time. She called the evidentiary portion to order, and Talia immediately called our first witness, a senior compliance officer from the National Bank. The bank officer swore under oath that the $2.3 million cash flow described in the plaintiff's complaint was a complete fabrication. He meticulously explained how the account sequencing and the specific effective dates listed on their supposed transfer confirmation directly contradicted the bank's internal ledger systems. The money had never existed in any capacity. Next, Talia called our independent digital forensic expert to the stand. He was a brilliant, highly analytical professional who dismantled my family's lies with terrifying precision. He projected the metadata extracted from Celeste's laptop onto a large screen for the entire courtroom to see. He walked the judge step by step through the digital modification history, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the foundational documents were freshly authored weeks before the lawsuit, not years ago. He then explained the physical trace evidence, pointing out the distinct microprinting dots left by the Sunridge office machines, detailing exactly how the pristine pages had been intentionally degraded and rescanned at low resolutions to simulate age. He called it a crude, amateur attempt at historical forgery. Then came Marisol. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high, no longer the terrified administrative assistant. Under Talia's careful questioning, Marisol clearly described the frantic, late-night printing sessions at the Sunridge offices. She did not just offer her word. We submitted the corresponding network printer logs, which perfectly matched the timestamps of her testimony. The final devastating blow from Marisol was an internal calendar email she had recovered. The subject line, typed carelessly by my brother, literally read, "Preparing family files for litigation." It was sent 2 days before they generated the fake promissory notes. The climax of our evidentiary presentation involved the subpoenaed internal communications from Westbrook Hale Cartwright. Talia handed a thick stack of printed emails up to Judge Ward. The emails explicitly demonstrated that Preston Vale had intentionally bypassed his firm's mandatory ethical conflict check in one specific message to a junior paralegal. Preston wrote that he needed to rush the filing immediately because he possessed intelligence that Blue Harbor was about to trigger a massive liquidity event. That single sentence permanently locked in his malicious motive. He had weaponized attorney-client privilege for personal financial extortion. By the time it was my family's turn to take the stand for cross-examination, their legal strategy had completely disintegrated. The lawyers from Price Kellett looked entirely defeated. Talia put my father, my mother, and my brother on the stand one by one. Under the crushing pressure of undeniable forensic proof, they turned on each other exactly as I knew they would. Victor desperately claimed he had locked the original agreement in his office safe on a Tuesday morning. Less than an hour later, Celeste swore she had personally placed the document in her bank safety deposit box on a Thursday night. Grant, panicking and trying to salvage the sinking ship, blurted out that he clearly remembered watching Victor put the papers in his briefcase before driving to a completely different county. With one single, frantic sentence, my brother inadvertently collapsed all three of their timelines. They were openly committing perjury, contradicting themselves under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Judge Ward had heard enough. She slammed her gavel down, her face dark with judicial outrage. She stated clearly for the official record that she had never witnessed such a blatant, poorly executed, and maliciously intended abuse of the civil justice system in her entire career on the bench. She dismissed my family's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. She denied every single one of their motions. Then, the heavy consequences arrived. Judge Ward ruled completely in our favor regarding the sanctions. She ordered the plaintiffs to fully reimburse every single dollar of my corporate and personal attorney fees. She officially transferred the entire dossier of forged documents, the audio recordings, and the perjury transcripts directly to the district attorney's office for a formal criminal review. Finally, she ordered a comprehensive professional disciplinary report to be filed with the state bar regarding Westbrook Hale Cartwright and Preston Vale's catastrophic ethical violations. When the gavel fell for the final time, there was no loud cheering from my side of the room. I did not stand up and shout in victory. I did not look across the aisle to gloat at my parents, who were currently being quietly briefed by their terrified lawyers about impending criminal indictments. I simply packed my leather portfolio, thanked Talia, and walked out the heavy wooden doors. The aftermath was profoundly quiet. I did not celebrate with champagne or public statements. Instead, I returned to Halcyon, Georgia, and officially closed Blue Harbor's Series C funding round, securing the company's future. A month later, I quietly established a vocational training fund dedicated to teaching young, underprivileged adults the legitimate, honest skills of disaster recovery construction. I named the foundation after my maternal grandmother, the only person in Port Sterling who had ever shown me genuine kindness. I chose to surround myself with the loyal, brilliant found family I had built at my company, completely walking away from the toxic, inescapable loop of my blood relatives. In the end, I won this war not because I screamed louder than they did, and not because I fought back with the same emotional cruelty they used against me. I won because my truth was saved on the exact right day, in the exact right file, backed by the exact right evidence. Their lies simply could not survive under the bright, unforgiving lights of a courtroom. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from today. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and share it so more people can hear it.